It's been a while, hasn't it? A lot has happened for me within the last year, so to get back into the swing of things, I wanted to talk about something very close and dear to me.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
Ah yes, this should be fun. I know that I've already talked about Sleeping Beauty back in the beginning of 2023, but that was just about one specific scene. And since I've gotten some comments saying that I should talk about the movie, and by comments I mean one, so screw it. I'm gonna once again talk about one of my childhood favourites. For what, 2 people who don't know this story? Here's a very brief summary. Having been uninvited to a royal christening, the evil Maleficent curses Princess Aurora to die if she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel before her 16th birthday. 3 fairies decide to hide and take care of Aurora to keep her safe. But surprise surprise, she eventually does prick her finger shortly after falling in love with Prince Philip. So it's up to the 3 fairies and Philip to defeat Maleficent and save Aurora from this evil curse. The movie was loosely based on the Tchaikovsky ballet of the same name, which was inspired by the Charles Perrault story of the same name, but the movie is by far the most famous version. It's about as simple a fairy tale as it gets, and like most of Disney's fairy tale lineup, it was heavily altered to make the story more conventionally told and emotionally driven, and I'll elaborate more on that later. So, here's a little personal background. When I was young, and I do mean really young, like a toddler and up to maybe 10 years old, I used to visit my grandparents all the time, literally every holiday. And my most vivid memories of these visits would be me watching Sleeping Beauty on repeat because my grandparents had it recorded on a VHS tape. This is also the same tape that Tintin and the Lake of Sharks was recorded on. Check out the video I made on that film if you haven't already. So yes, I do have a huge bias towards this film. I know it very well, and nostalgia does play a big part in my enjoyment of it. But as with any film I talk about, I will look at it critically and address both its strengths and flaws. Because, after all, no film, even our personal favourites, is perfect. So, with that said, what's good about the film? First and foremost, well, just look at it. It looks incredible. At the time, this was Disney's most expensive animated film, and that money is visible with every frame. Its art style was created by the incredible Ivan Earl, who was chosen by Disney to create a look that was not only different from any of their previous films, but could also emulate the style of Mary Blair. She was the main concept artist behind films like Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland. Her art tends to focus more on the simplicity of specific shapes, along with eye-popping vibrant colours. This art style, along with medieval tapestry, inspired Ivan Earl to create a distinctly 2D look for the film, which is not a bad thing I must add. Definitely check out both of their artwork if you can. They also had to struggle with finding a balance in regards to the character designs. They needed them to match the style of the backgrounds, while still being unmistakably Disney characters. Thankfully, character designer and animator Mark Davis would both find that balance while also making the necessary compromises that both suited what Earl and Disney wanted, and here we are. After all of that, the animators would then use the multiplane camera technique, which they perfected, to add a feeling of depth to these backgrounds thanks to the parallax effect. That's when objects move in the foreground faster than those in the background. This makes the world and the characters feel more three-dimensional and believable, but the film also knows the importance of just letting a shot stay still, allowing us to be sucked into its atmosphere. This was the first animated film to use what's called the Super Technorama 70 process, and the second one to be shot in anamorphic widescreen. The first was Lady and the Tramp, released 4 years earlier. Basically, both of these techniques compressed the footage to fit onto the film roll and then stretched out to its normal width during the projection. So in other words, no Disney animated film prior to this and Lady and the Tramp were this grand in scale in terms of how it filled the screen. It's funny to see the striking difference this simple choice makes when comparing films like Snow White or Cinderella to this. The animation in general certainly had the most significant impact on the film's budget of $6 million, and is the shining example of Disney pushing the limits of what they could accomplish. To me, no other Disney animated film comes this close to size and scale, even many of the modern ones, or even from the Disney Renaissance, and I will gladly die on that hill. Next is the music. As I stated in my previous Sleeping Beauty video, the music was composed by George Bruns, who was inspired by the Tchaikovsky ballet. And what a perfect example of adapting something from one form of entertainment to the big screen. Bruns very cleverly straight up took parts of the ballet's soundtrack and recontextualized it to fit each scene perfectly, which then allowed the animators to use it as a guide when pacing and then animating the characters. Yes, I did look it up this time. They did indeed compose the music first, then animated the scenes afterwards. I elaborated more on that in my previous video, but it really is incredible how Bruns was able to take the iconic music of Tchaikovsky's ballet and change its significance and placement within the story, and yet still manage to make it memorable. Whether it's enchanting, romantic, or even terrifying. No joke, this is easily one of my favourite film soundtracks of all time. Now let's take a look at our characters. We have the three good fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. They're all wonderful. Each is unique in their own way, brave and decisive, kind and thoughtful, and hard-headed and fiery. All of them complement each other perfectly, leading to some great chemistry, as well as numerous funny moments. But the one thing that truly unites them is both their love and loyalty to the Princess Aurora, who, let's remind ourselves, is technically their adopted daughter of 16 years. Speaking of which, I'll save the topic of Aurora herself as well as Prince Philip for later, because I certainly have a lot to say about them. And then of course we have our villain, Maleficent. Oh Maleficent, thou art such a wondrous badass mistress of all evil. And before you say it, yes, I did briefly talk about her in my previous Sleeping Beauty video, but there I didn't go into detail about her as a character. Maleficent is by far one of my absolute favourite villains of all time. What's funny is on the surface her motivation seems surprisingly weak, getting uninvited to a christening. But there are two things to consider. One is that a simple motive isn't inherently a bad thing. We've seen examples where being pretty one note can work within the context of the film, and as this is a fairy tale, making the characters super layered and complex isn't a priority. Maleficent is to me the prime example of a character who works entirely because of the execution, and they didn't have to go all out, from Mark Davis's phenomenal design to her incredible vocal performance from Eleanor Audley, but they certainly did. And so much of it does come from her performance. After all, aside from being the voice, she was also the main reference as she would perform her scenes on a soundstage in costume. The other thing to consider is that supposedly, during the time period of the film, it was considered a huge insult if one wasn't invited to a christening, as it was usually a big public event. So in a bizarre way, her motivation is somewhat more understandable. Naturally, her methods for getting back at everyone are what makes her evil. But with this info, it's harder to claim that her motivation is that weak, especially considering some of the other villains that came prior had pretty shallow desires, such as being driven by vanity, jealousy, or simple greed. Okay, now for the stuff I'm less fond of, Aurora and Phillip. People have made fun of how little personality they have, or even how they barely affect the plot. And while I certainly don't disagree with them, I want to bring up a few things that don't get discussed as much in regards to the pair of them. One could argue they are not supposed to be the main characters. They have surprisingly little screen time and are pretty flat in terms of their development. It is the fairies who are active in the story. They're the ones who come up with the plan, and they're the ones who do everything, including the climax. Despite Philip doing the fighting, he becomes nothing more than a silent character who is aided with magical buffs. If anything, both these characters feel more like plot devices as opposed to protagonists. It is problematic since aside from Maleficent, Aurora and Phillip are easily the most marketable characters, so I have to ask, where are the fairies? Oh, there they are! Even seeing Sleeping Beauty as a simple fairy tale doesn't really help, since any character, even in classic fairy tales, has to learn some kind of important life lesson. That is what these stories were originally created for. In this movie, however, Aurora and Phillip don't learn anything. In fact, none of the characters do. Even the fairies, they stay more or less the same from beginning to end. You would think that, for example, Aurora would have something more to offer other than looking pretty and singing. But on the upside, she does look nice and sings well. Did I say sing well? What the fuck am I talking about? Her singing is beautiful, but then again, what do you expect from Walt Disney hiring Mary Costa, an actual opera singer? And I'll say that Aurora's two songs certainly make up for what I definitely consider the weakest part of the film. Even as a child, I always remember wanting to skip the middle portion where it just focuses on Aurora and Phillip. Which reminds me, I can't defend the romance in this movie. I just can't. Even by fairy tale standards, it's pretty weak. They just suddenly meet up after Phillip follows the sound of Aurora singing like some kind of siren's victim, then he butts in on her song, which wouldn't really fly today, but that's okay because they both apparently met each other before in the same dream, as though they're in a Christopher Nolan film, and then he kisses her when she's essentially in a coma-like state. Yeah, I sadly don't buy it. Oh well, suppose it could be worse. At least in later Disney fairy tale films, the main couple takes some time to get to know each other and develop chemistry. Granted, it is usually over a short period of time, but it's at least something. Wait, didn't I say I wanted to bring up some things that hadn't really been discussed before? Right, let me get to that. So when I rewatched the film recently, my girlfriend brought up an interesting point. Roughly over halfway through, Aurora returns to the cottage all happy that she met Philip. The fairies surprise her for her birthday and then drop the bombshell about who she really is, and that she can't marry the guy she literally just met because she's already betrothed. This naturally upsets her, and this is what my girlfriend had to say about this moment. She felt really sorry for her. Think about what she has to be feeling at this point. Her whole world and everything she knew has come crashing down on her. She just found out she was a princess and not a simple fair maiden named Briar Rose. Her adopted mothers aren't her real ones and are fairies. And she can't be with the man she loves because she was already betrothed pretty much the day she was born, despite all that she's ever wanted was to find someone special, which is what one of her songs, I Wonder, is about. That's one hell of a shock to the system with so much to process all at once, especially for a 16-year-old. This also makes me want to bring up a thought that the film only hints at. They do somewhat address a few times about how some traditions should change, specifically the notion of betrothing two people who have never met, in this case for the purpose of uniting two kingdoms by marriage. And yet the bride and groom-to-be actually meet without knowing who the other is. And yes, I know I just made fun of the romance, but I'll give the film points for having the couple actually choosing who they want to be with, without the pressure of being forced into marriage because of tradition or some political reason. In fact, I kinda want to give Philip of all characters some credit because of how he's willing to throw away his title as prince, as well as his ties to his own kingdom, for a woman who he believes to be a mere peasant girl, a commoner. He doesn't know who she really is, and it's clear that he doesn't care about titles. Yeah, even he has qualities, or a quality, I should say, that I never appreciated until now. And this subject even gets brought up by his father, King Huber, when he wants to discuss the marriage with King Stefan, Aurora's father. It is hinted that he's willing to potentially make changes if it will make their children happy. It just so happens that the whole romantic subplot worked in everybody's favour. The prince and princess fall for each other, and the kings get to unite their kingdoms. I know this might sound blasphemous, but I do feel if this film had one more rewrite, or dare I say, a remake. No, not that one. I mean a proper remake of this story. I feel like they could really dive into the pressures of marriage that they have and all that. Make Aurora and Phillip more active characters, flesh out their romance, and space it out more evenly throughout the film, and I think you could have a pretty decent remake. Who knows? And just to briefly rewind to the subject of the two kings, that's probably my other problem with the film. Over halfway through, we fade to a scene with the pair of them discussing their children and their future, with Stefan being more caring about his daughter's feelings, while Hubert wants to quickly jump to the marriage and then living together and having children and all that. And while the scene itself is not bad, I'd be lying if I said this wasn't a moment I also wanted to skip as a child. Don't get me wrong, I was naturally entertained by the minstrel's attempt to drink the wine he's serving, and the song the two kings sing called Scums. But firstly, the song itself doesn't really move the plot forward or develop the characters, it just grinds the film to a halt. It's literally just a drinking song. That's it. Cut it out, you missed nothing. There is in fact a deleted song on the soundtrack called It Hams I Have a Picture, where both kings are talking about the qualities of their children, and let me just say, it would have been much better if they had kept it instead of Scumps. That sounded weird phrasing it like that. The actual dialogue in the scene could be really interesting as we do get a little bit of insight into both kings, but since it's pretty much late into the film, it does seem, well, random to be diving into the importance of their unison at this point. It definitely could have been better if it had been placed right at the beginning, and it's only really told to us through the opening narration. The best way I can describe how I feel about the scene is like when you watch a film, then you watch a bunch of deleted scenes and you understand why they were cut, except here, that kind of scene is in the movie. This whole part could have been a major subplot, but as it is, it really does stick out like a sore thumb, since there's hardly any other major scenes that allow us to get to know what's going on in the kingdom itself. But with that said, all my criticisms aside, I will say that one thing Disney is surprisingly good at, especially with a lot of their early films, is to highlight the emotional impact of their scenes. We can sit here, nitpicking all day at how many of their older films haven't aged as well or aren't as developed and all that, but when it comes to how they keep us emotionally invested, especially as children, it really is something to praise. And nowhere is that more apparent to me personally than with the death of Aurora. I already dove into the scene where she pricks her finger, so I won't talk about it much here. But what follows is, in my opinion, one of the saddest scenes in Disney history. It's where the fairies lay her to rest in the tower, and they decide that in order to save the kingdom from the horror of learning what happened, they put everyone to sleep. Sure, it's no death of Mufasa or Bambi's mum, but the slow pace, mournful chorus, and the changing colours almost gives this scene the feeling of a lullaby, which is fitting. This scene reminds us of what Aurora meant to all the characters, even if they don't know the truth. She brought them joy and light like the dawn, and all this happens following the sunset. Misery and darkness follows, emphasized by the choice of everything turning into a greenish tone, which by this point we associate green with Maleficent, creates that feeling that she won, and technically she has. And of course, I can't forget about the fairies themselves. What must they be feeling at this point? They not only failed their mission, but they lost the only person they saw as their own child, their own Briar Rose as they named her. Like any effective death scene, it's not just the fact that the person is gone, it's the terrible feeling of emptiness that follows. So even if I didn't fully understand the context of the scene when I was little, I certainly felt it. And speaking of importance, the rest of the film follows up with that emotional importance. They've reached their lowest point, and so much is resting on the shoulders of the fairies and Philip. This leads to one of my all-time favourite film climaxes. Similar to Disney's Robin Hood, it starts out with a lot of quiet sneaking around, but once they're caught escaping, it's nothing but an intense skirmish all the way to the end, from an army of goons, a forest of thorns, and of course Maleficent herself, all brought to life almost solely through the animation and music. And I have to once again say, without trying to repeat what I said in the previous video, just how incredible George Bruns was at taking classical music meant for a ballet and adapting it to fit this scene in particular, and all without drastically changing the tone or melody of the original compositions, similar to Fantasia. It all comes together to create a truly spectacular work of art. And that statement pretty much summarizes my feelings on this film. Sure, there's a lot to criticize and make fun of, from some of the lackluster characters and certain individual scenes that don't really progress anything, but what really makes the film shine is in its gorgeous animation, excellent music, memorable side characters, and of course its amazing villain. I'm glad that nostalgia isn't the film's saving grace. How can it be when it has so much more to offer? With every viewing, the strong parts get better, while the lesser ones seem less bothersome. God, am I glad I decided to check this film out again. I definitely needed to talk about something that has meant so much to me longer than any other animated film I can think of, making it one of my favourite animated films of all time. What about you all? What do you think of the movie? If you haven't seen it, be sure to check it out and let me know what you think in the comments below. I love reading them. Now if you'll excuse me, while you all do that, I think I'll go watch Sleeping Beauty again. I'll see you all at the next one.